So sometimes I'm asked, what are the rules about altering contract terms? So obviously this depends on whether or not you have an oral contract or a written contract, but assuming we have a written contract, what are the rules that you would use to change those terms, change those clauses? So for the most part, a contract is going to control how changes are made. And if the contract was made by an attorney, or even if it was made by someone who pulled a template off of the internet on a contract, there's probably going to be provisions inside of that contract that prevent the terms from being changed, except in writing and by unanimous consent of all of the parties in the contract. The reality is, however, sometimes there's things that happen within a contract where the parties, by their course of dealing and course of conduct, meaning the way they behave themselves, can actually change to some extent the terms of a contract. So even if an agreement, a written agreement, says you can only change it in writing, their conduct can actually change it. And so, for example, if rent or something like that in a lease, or a payment is due by a certain date, and there's an agreement by the parties where they say, you know what, it doesn't need to be on the 1st of the month. Go ahead and send it to me on the 15th of the month. And over a period of time, a payment is made late, according to the terms of the contract. There's a course of dealing and a course of conduct that can change the terms of a contract to allow what's referred to as substantial compliance, meaning you followed the rules, but you kind of were lax about it and you didn't follow it to the letter. And if one of the parties says, you know what, your payment is late this month, it was due on the 1st of the month, and now you're late because it's the 10th of the month and we haven't received it. Many courts will say, well, even though the contract says payment is due by the 1st, they've substantially complied because they ultimately did pay. There was a course of dealing or course of conduct that changed the terms of the agreement, and you never put the other side on notice that you were going to have them strictly comply with the letter of the agreement. And so even though there's a provision in a contract that says it can only be changed in writing, your behavior, your conduct can actually change the terms of a contract. It may not be permanent, but certainly enough for a party to turn around and say, hey, wait a second, I substantially comply with the terms of the agreement. In addition, if there's terms inside of a contract that are otherwise illegal, right, or unenforceable, for example, some states don't allow certain types of non-competes or non-solicitation agreements, what are referred to as right-to-work states. You may have an ironclad non-compete that says, for a period of 50 years, you can't work in this area or this industry. Well, that clause is illegal and unenforceable, and most times court will continue to enforce the terms of the contract, but will strike that agreement as if it didn't exist, or that clause as a result of it not having existed. In addition, sometimes there's something called a material term, and there's something called a non-material term. So a material term will be strictly enforced by a court, but if you breach a contract, right, like you fail to follow strictly to the letter of a contract, you don't actually come to an agreement on the change of the term, you just stop doing something. If the term is ultimately determined to be something called non-material, courts may be very slow or loath to enforce a contract on its face where the term is non-material and the breach doesn't really cause any kind of harm. So while written agreements may say you can't change the terms of this agreement except by writing and by consent by everybody, you can change it by your conduct, you can change it if you don't identify a clause as being material as opposed to non-material. And parties, sometimes enter into illegal agreements without even knowing it, and those agreements are not enforced by courts. And so even though contracts can change by agreement, there's other ways that contracts won't be enforced, and so it's effectively as if the contract terms had changed. If you have any questions with regard to this issue or any others, my name is Michael Smikin. Contact me directly at Callagy Law, and we'll answer this and any other question that you have.